Oregon's got a 2026 decommitment. I'm not worried about that. I am keeping my eye on something else.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time. Once again, for Locked On Ducks, I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Lots coming today, plenty of recruiting buzz. Someone suggested Dana Altman might retire, and he had a Dana Altman-esque response to that remark, all on today's show, which is brought to you by the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay with us for the Armada Team of the Week later in the episode. I could pick a number of different Oregon teams for the Team of the Week because everyone's kind of rolling right now. But Oregon's got a decommitment in the class of 2026. These sorts of things happen. Bott Mulitalo decommitted from my neck of the woods, actually, out here in the great state of Utah. He's from Lone Peak High School, which is up in American Fork, kind of in the Salt Lake City-ish area. Now, one of the reasons for this decommitment could be, I haven't been able to confirm this with anybody yet, but he was originally recruited to Oregon as a defensive lineman. Now he's listed as an offensive lineman, might be undergoing a position change, 6'4", 275. I imagine he'd want to bulk up a bit if he wants to play on the offensive line, because 6'4", 275 keeps you a little bit more nimble to play on the defensive side. But I look at this as, okay, Oregon has one less defensive line commit, and I'm not super worried about, him going elsewhere. Not that he doesn't look like a good player. He definitely does, and I'd rather have good players than not. But Oregon's defensive line haul right now looks really, really good. So if the flip to offensive line is why he decided to decommit, Oregon's pursuits on that front are myriad, and I've talked about them here on the show several times. Emmanuel Iheanacho, who is a 5-star offensive lineman, trending heavily towards Maryland. He's from that area. We'll see if that's where he locks in a verbal commitment to. Jackson Cantwell, Oregon, is after him as well. But the player who I am keeping my eye on here is Kodi Greene. So Kodi Greene has locked in a couple of visits for the summer. On June 6th, he'll be visiting Oregon. Then the following weekend, he'll go to Texas, and the following weekend, he will go to USC. Now, a couple of thoughts there. First of all, not uncommon for players that are verbally committed to take visits elsewhere. Oregon, of course, does that with other schools' commits all the time. But, again, think of a verbal commitment as a strong leader in the clubhouse, but the final scores haven't been signed and scorecards haven't yet been ratified just yet for those of you that are golfers out there. But Kodi Greene is Oregon's highest rated commit right now in the class of 2025. That could change if Jared Curtis were to pick Oregon. 5-star quarterback, number 1 overall signal caller, was on campus for an unofficial visit yesterday and is here in Eugene, or there in Eugene, I should say, throughout the week. Definitely keeping my eye on that. But Oregon has been kind of gearing up to go after a lot of big-time recruits along the offensive line. And maybe it would make sense in my head, though I haven't talked to Bott Mulitalo personally. If he were going to play offensive line, maybe he looked at who Oregon's going after and who they've already got and thought, no, I have a better chance to play earlier in my career elsewhere. Again, speculative on my part, but I think that is a somewhat reasonable inference if that's where his head is at there. But Kodi Greene could absolutely flip. It is entirely possible. I still like where Oregon is at, obviously with his verbal commitment currently being to the Ducks right now. But just know that Texas and USC are going to make a serious push there. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, do you notice whose name popped up there once again? Someone who I talked about last week on the show, who Oregon just swept in baseball down in Los Angeles. That's USC. Just kind of keeps popping up. Last couple years for these sorts of kids, didn't feel like I ever saw the Trojans kind of hovering around the same number of players that Oregon was going after. Not that there haven't been battles between the two schools in the last couple of years, but when I see, the players that Oregon is going after and, they've narrowed their choices down to the top 3 or 4, I'll talk about another one later in the show. it seems to me like USC's popping up more and more. A big reason for that is they hired a general manager. They hired him away from Notre Dame, and that's paying dividends right now. USC's got the top class in the class of 2026 at the moment. There's still, of course, a long way to go, but this isn't a place where they've consistently been in the last couple of years. But just continue to get used to that. USC is going to keep trying to pop up and be a preeminent recruiting power out west alongside Oregon, but the Ducks are still number one out west for now. Not technically with the rankings, but over the last couple of years, Oregon's been a better recruiter. Them's just the facts. So going back to the Mulitalo decommitment, though, and I look at it as, okay, Oregon has one less defensive lineman. This 2026 class for Oregon is shaping up to me looking like a little bit like the 2023 class, where you just had a heavy emphasis on building in the trenches, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Right now, Oregon has got 4 players committed along the defensive line. In the 2023 class, they had 10. A good number of those guys are still on the roster. Not all of them are, but, Mateo was in that cycle. Purchase and Tuioti were in that cycle. Terrence Green might have a role this year. He was in that class. Then there are other guys like Johnny Bowens who transferred out. Jaden Moore has transferred out as well. But right now, Oregon's current defensive line haul is Tamuhini Topui, who is a 4-star from Mater Dei High School, a place that Oregon recruits quite a bit. Tony Cumberland, who is a highly rated 4-star guy, had 5-star status at one point, but is no longer in that realm. Still a really talented kid, of course. Mateo Uiagalelei and Aiden Breland had the same rankings drops. There are a lot of different reasons why that happens. Cumberland is at Willamette High School now. They've got Viliami Moala, who's a 3-star defensive lineman from Mater Dei High School, and Dutch Horace, who's a 3-star edge from St. John Bosco High School as well. So that's a pretty solid foundation. They're not done along the defensive line. There are other offers and names that they'll be looking at in the coming months, I would expect. But, 4 is a pretty solid place to be for the month of March for one position group. And, this is an Oregon recruiting class in 2026 that right now is very defensively focused. And whether that's just how the timings worked out with when certain kids have committed, or whether that's an emphasis from the staff, it's kind of hard to say. It's a little bit early, but right now the only offensive players are Kodi Greene, the offensive tackle I mentioned, the 5-star, and Kendre Harrison, another 5-star who's listed as an athlete, but likely is going to play tight end. Also a basketball player for Dana Altman and company if he chooses to do that. Guys have done it before. Jonathan Lloyd played on special teams a little bit. I don't know about a ton. At the end of his basketball career, Jordan Kent, of course, was a 2-way player. I don't know that Josh Connerly ever pondered it, but Connerly was a high school basketball player as well. So, it's happened. You never know. And then they've got Tredarian Ball as well, their running back commit in the class of 2026, who is a freakishly good athlete and a really, really fun player to watch on his highlight reel. So overall, I'm not overly concerned because of how Oregon has stacked the defensive line recruiting so far about Mulitalo decommitting, but definitely we'll be tracking what happens with Kodi Greene, because that's a position group that Oregon has got just one guy committed at right now in this cycle, and Greene has got all the talent in the world to be a great offensive tackle. So those are the updates for this segment, but there are more updates coming in the next segment, though. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments. Hit me up on Twitter. Become a Locked On Ducks Insider. You can do all or any of those things. Any is probably the more efficient option for all of you out there. Couple names to know, and what exactly does resetting mean? That's what's coming up next. What to know right now, this episode brought to you by Nissan. The Armada Team of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, our Locked On College basketball experts are picking one team that stands apart. From top-seeded stars to the unexpected upsets, these guys showcase the strength and sheer power needed to push their team forward. Nationally, the Duke Blue Devils are the team of the week, led by National Player of the Year candidate Cooper Flagg. I'm going with Oregon, though. Rivalry games on the road. Nate Biddle, 36 points. Give me Oregon as a national team of the week. This is an Oregon podcast. After all, that's your Nissan team of the week. Nate Biddle will be your Nissan player of the week. Who needs this Cooper Flag guy? The Blazers. That's the name. The Blazers need Cooper Flag. When it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer, and that's exactly what Oregon did in Seattle, getting the season sweep over the Huskies. It's clear that our team of the week is out here ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of Nissan's outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop at nissanusa.com. Some people have like mental tics or cues that they use to dial themselves in. That's the second segment set for me. Just dialing back in. So, a couple of names to know before I get to a mailbag question and talk about Dana Altman to finish today's show. Talanoa Ely, 4-star linebacker, according to Chad Simmons of On3, is visiting Oregon, USC, and Oklahoma all this week. Busy week? I mean, it's spring break some places, so maybe that's coinciding with his high school schedule. I am not certain, but that's a busy week to go to those three places. I know Eugene has, I'm sure, a couple of direct flights down to the Southern California area, but then you're going all the way to Oklahoma to get to Norman. That's a long way out there to get to Oklahoma City. But once again, as I mentioned earlier, Oregon's going after a guy, defensive side of the ball, and what do you know? USC is in the fold. Their new defensive coordinator and the new general manager make them just kind of a more of a threat than I think they were in the last couple of years. That's why I keep bringing them up, because they keep popping up. You know, I see a finalist for, someone like Brandon Arrington, who's a 5-star defensive back, likely plays corner in college and, listed as an athlete, but probably a corner. He is considering a bunch of different schools, bunch of big names, USC in the fold, and USC just keeps popping up. So I'm not worried about it per se. I just think it's an interesting trend across college football. And if there is another school out west that is able to go toe-to-toe with Oregon when they are at their best, the answer is USC. There is no better recruiting school west of the Mississippi, most likely. I'm trying to think. Colorado just uses the transfer portal. They're not a big threat there. Yeah, I mean, I guess the Mississippi River would have some schools west of it that are in the state of Texas. Maybe. I don't know where the University of Texas is in relation to the Mississippi. I think it's just west of it. I should know that geography off the top of my head, but alas, I do not. Anyway, so in the western part of the United States, though, it's Oregon, and the one that can get up to that level, recruiting-wise, is USC. And then there's another one. 4-star wide receiver, Caden Dixon-Wyatt, who will have visits lined up over the stretch of May 16th to June 20th, visiting Bama, Ohio State, USC, Texas, and Oregon as well. So just a couple of names to keep your eye on there, tidbits and things that might float around. You never know. But those are names to know as the 2026 class continues to build itself out. Oregon, with the decommitment from Mulitalo, is down to 9 players. And in the 2025 class, they technically took 20, but one of those was JKS, who, as I talked about at the time, the 5-star quarterback who's at Cal, was never really wanting to be at Oregon. So, he was kind of any port in a storm as to why he committed there. So it ended up being 19. Wouldn't be surprised if after a relatively smaller class compared to the previous two, Oregon gets back over 20. It's kind of that 20 to 25 range, but we'll see how that all works out. Mailbag time, YouTube comments, Twitter, become a Locked On Ducks Insider, link in the description below. You can get a free 14-day trial. All ways to get in the mailbag. This from DWC Sports. Mailbag question. I know we're consistently talking about how this upcoming season will be Oregon's, quote, rebuild year, but one thing that keeps coming to my mind is everyone's words about Dante Moore. Well, I want to make something very clear here, DWC Sports. I'm talking about it like that. Not everybody shares that particular vantage point. I was listening to Josh Pate the other day, who I think sees Oregon the same way I do, of, it's a reload, but is it the same kind of reload, as what you would see at a Georgia or Alabama in its peak where, might not be as good, but they're still going to, get to the Final Four, when Oregon didn't get there a season ago, of course. But, you just said we're constantly talking like, well, I mean, I do. And I know some people, I've won some people over with that particular viewpoint. Don't know that everyone necessarily sees it that way. But continuing on with the question, especially Tez Johnson, Bo Nick's brother. Are you telling me they're related? I am hearing this for the first time. First time in my entire life. Especially Tez Johnson, who said he will be in New York as a Heisman finalist. Combine that with the schedule. Do you think this is really that big of a percentage drop for UO to win it all this year compared to last season? Yeah, when you lose 4 offensive linemen, 3 defensive linemen who will all get drafted, one of your offensive linemen's a first or second round pick, another one's probably a later round pick, 2 linebackers, 6 defensive backs, and your quarterback, who was the most experienced player in the history of college football, and your 2 leading wide receivers. Yeah, or 2 of your leading wide receivers, I should say. No matter how well you've recruited, that's a lot. That is a heck of a lot to lose. But to your point about, the level of dropout, everything is relative, right? So this makes sense in my head in golf terms. And since I'm the host of the show, you're just going to have to deal with another golf analogy from me here. So Rory McIlroy, who I've compared to Oregon to, because they have a lot of similarities, is a really, really good player. Now, nationally, all you will hear for the most part, unless you dive super deep into golf content like I do about Rory McIlroy, is, well, he hasn't won a major in 11 years. Well, he hasn't, but between now and then, he's had ebbs and flows. But Rory McIlroy's ebb and flow isn't like everyone else's or a normal player. Scottie Scheffler's the number 1 player in the world. When he struggles, quote unquote, he finishes like top 15, which at a golf tournament is really good. A lot of guys, most guys on tour would go out, have a top 15 week. Now, I'm not saying they'd be jumping for joy, but they'd say, yeah, I feel like I played well this week. Scottie Scheffler plays poorly and still finishes in the top 15 by his standards. I mean, he was winning, at an almost Tiger Woods-like rate last season. He won the Masters. He won the Players. He won the RBC Heritage, I think. He won at Bay Hill. Like, it was really insane. And he was in contention in a bunch of other majors as well, was routinely finishing inside the top 10. So Oregon has that same sort of trait about its football program right now. And I expect it to continue going along that trend until something changes dramatically. Either Phil Knight passes away and, there's no money coming through Oregon from Nike anymore, or Dan Lanning leaves and then the university decides, no, we don't want to care about football ever again. Barring one of those 2 things happening, this will be what it is for Oregon, where I'm still here in, the kind of the early middle portion of March, in my head expecting Oregon to be a playoff caliber team because of the schedule they have and the talent they'll have on the roster in 2025. Now, for most schools in the country, that's a great season, right? Arizona State last year goes to the playoff, and a disappointing, heartbreaking loss with a poor call from the officials. There were bad calls both ways, but there was one late in the game that hurt Arizona State, and the Sun Devils feel better about that outcome, conference championship, lose your first playoff game, than Oregon does, because they have different levels of expectations. So when I say reset or rebuild year, there's still a certain floor for Oregon that I expect them to be able to hit that I don't see why they wouldn't be able to going into next year. But in terms of winning the national championship, find me the last time that a guy starting his first full season of college football won a national title. It's been a run of veteran quarterbacks as of late. J.J. McCarthy was in his 2nd year starting with Michigan, and I think his 3rd year with the program overall. Will Howard was in his 5th year of college football this past season for Ohio State. Stetson Bennett had been around since pre-COVID, won back-to-back with Georgia. Bryce Young, I don't believe, was in his freshman season when he won at Alabama. Like, you just keep going down the list. Bryce Young didn't win national championship. Mac Jones did. And Mac Jones had been there for a little while. Might have been his first season starting, don't remember. But, that's not the only factor that I look at and say, yeah, I don't know that Oregon has the same ceiling as they did last year. I do still think their floor, as I mentioned, is incredibly high, but it's just a lot of turnover in one season to play at a championship level. When we saw this past year, how talented that team was, how veteran that team was, with Dylan Gabriel at quarterback and a bunch of other guys, they still weren't able to get it done. So asking a relatively younger group of guys to play at that level, I have that hope, but I don't have that expectation necessarily. I always hope. This would be the greatest incorrect take I've ever had, be the most enjoyable one anyway. But I hope that makes sense. And I'm glad you broke news here on the show that Bo Nix and Tez Johnson are related. I have never heard that before. I have heard briefly the Dana Altman retirement question. Yeah, some thoughts on that notion. Attention Locked On Duck fans, ever wish you could directly support Oregon athletes and be a part of their journey? Now you can with Roy, the NIL app that puts fans in control. Before Roy, NIL deals were often handled behind closed doors, and fans like you didn't have a clear way to directly support the players you love. Now with Roy, you can make a real impact and feel closer to Oregon's athletes. With Roy, you get to choose the player you want to support, decide how much you want to contribute, get exclusive content straight from the athletes that you back. And the best part, if the player transfers, you get your money back, so it's a risk-free way to show your support and make your voice heard. Support your favorite players directly and help shape the future of Oregon sports. Download the Roy app now from the App Store and start backing Oregon athletes the way they deserve with transparency, trust, and real impact. This is the future of college sports. Join it now by downloading Roy and supporting your favorite players. So there was a piece over at ESPN.com that Dana Altman got asked about with regards to his retirement. And I understand where everyone is coming from here. I could very easily paint this in a picture of, this is a ridiculous headline. Why is this question getting asked? Why is Dana Altman not admitting the truth? Like, I could do any of that sort of stuff, but people have been with me for a while. I appreciate you very much, by the way. I think you know that's not really how I roll. So there's a piece over at ESPN that is examining the national glance at the coaching carousel in college basketball. And so the guy that wrote this piece goes through and lists the open jobs that could come open, and, you know, coaches that might retire and all this. And then someone reads that and then relays the question back to Dana Altman. Everyone in this sequence of events is doing their job, and I don't think is doing so in a ridiculous way. To write the piece and look at a 66-year-old coach and wonder, could he retire without having any, you know, firsthand information on that front, is not an unreasonable thing to do. It's the middle of March. I'm still talking about Oregon football. I'm in the content business. I get it. It's not an unreasonable, speculative comment to make. And then when that gets picked up and then asked to Dana Altman in his weekly press conference, you know, he shrugged it off and had a very Dana Altman-like response where, you know, he said something to the effect, Matt Prame of 24/7 Sports had tweeted out that, you know, he was joking that 66 is the new 40, or that 66 isn't that old. I had tweeted out that 66 is the new 40. But, you know, I think that for Dana Altman, like, eventually he won't be Oregon's basketball coach. But I don't know when that's going to be. Certainly you can't look at what he's done the last couple of years and say that his performance is dropping off. There was a brief period in time where you could have said that. You know, not making the tournament 2 years in a row. I went into last season actually saying, you know, if Oregon misses the tournament for a third straight year, I'll start to ask the question, does Oregon want to go find a new basketball coach? Now, it's not as if he, you know, had run the program into the ground and when they were winning 10, 12 games. Like, he's reset the standard, like Oregon football, very high standard. Basketball, Dana Altman has reset the standard as well. He's the winningest coach in the history of the program and has more NCAA tournament wins than the rest of Oregon's coaches in the past combined, I'm pretty sure, or somewhere in that regard. Like, he's 15-7 all time in the NCAA tournament. That's a pretty darn good tournament record. So for Dana Altman, eventually there will come a time where he doesn't want to coach anymore and go through the grind of it. But clearly that time isn't now. Because if they'd missed the tournament for a third straight year last season, I would have said, boy, I don't know, this isn't looking great. but then they go win the Pac-12 tournament. And going back to my point about Oregon football and building, that, national championship seasons rarely just happen. They're built upon over several years. It's true in basketball as well. Last year was a huge momentum season for Oregon, but there was a ceiling on that team. They didn't have the depth they needed. I think they are a deeper team this year. And I think part of the reason they were able to attract players like Brandon Angel and TJ Bamba, who are both starters for the Ducks. Neither one has played great in the last couple of weeks, but they have been starters throughout the course of this season. Or why you attract a player like Jackson Shellstad, who they recruited for a very long time, or why Nate Biddle would want to come back, or, any of these guys or newcomers, Supreme Cook, who has done some good things for Oregon this year. You do that by going out and having a great season and making players go, oh, I want a piece of that. Oh, look, Dana Altman's still got it. He's still coaching at a high level. I want to see how I can be a part of it. How can I contribute to that? So you win the Pac-12 tournament last year with a great run. You're literally 1 minute with a 4-point lead against Creighton away from going to the Sweet 16. And now they've built on that momentum and carried it over into this season, both in how they use that to acquire new talent and also getting valuable experience for the talent that they have recruited over the last several cycles, Jackson Shellstad and KJ Evans most notably. So those guys will go into this year's NCAA tournament and the Big Ten tournament on Thursday. Big preview of that game tomorrow on the show with Jacob Goins of Locked On Hoosiers. They'll go into the NCAA tournament with some experience having been there before. That sort of stuff is valuable. And so there's no drop off here, right? So the original speculation that came from outside the program was not unwarranted because Dana Altman is 66. Look at these coaches that have retired across college basketball. Eventually, father time wins out. But what Dana Altman is showing is, in his response by saying, I don't think I'm that old. I don't think I act that old. I don't think 66 is that old. Well, that's an answer from a guy that clearly wants to keep doing it. The results on the court continue to get better season over season after there was a bit of a lull. There's no real, indicator that he shouldn't be Oregon's basketball coach right now. I don't see it. Even if they go and lose in the second round this year, it's still like he's had a good season. It was better than last year. And you just keep building and building on this sort of stuff. And, he went on to say he still loves coming into work. He still loves coaching. I think he's plenty well compensated. He makes about $4 million a year. What more do you want? What more are you looking for here? But, I get how, Altman, he gave another part of the quote where he was saying, I don't even know where this stuff comes from and whatnot. Well, it didn't come from anywhere. The indication from the reporter at ESPN was not that, he had an inside source that Dana Altman's going to retire, that he's going to leave or do this, that, and the other thing. No, he was just looking at the college basketball landscape and saying, hey, he's 66, right? It was like, I read the piece. It was kind of a throw-in line of sorts. It made sense. It was talking about him and Rick Barnes at Tennessee. And Tennessee, by the way, believe is a very good program. Rick Barnes, historically been a really good coach. And eventually, those guys will stop. Eventually, is it now? It's just kind of a discussion point. So I get why it was originally suggested. I get why the question is asked. And I really understand why Dana Altman's answer was what it is. And I'm happy that it is. Because clearly, the guy still knows how to coach. Here he is on a W7 going into the Big Ten tournament on Thursday, still with plenty on the line and plenty to be gained for the Ducks in that matchup. But, I understand those who came to be critical of Dana Altman when they missed the tournament in back-to-back years, because that wasn't the standard that he had set. Coming out of that COVID-impacted tournament, they were gifted a win in the first round against VCU, but then backed it up by beating the crap out of Iowa, who was the 2 seed, and then they got destroyed by USC in that Sweet 16 game. But then, missing the tournament next couple of years in a row, well, that's not where Oregon basketball is supposed to be. But now it feels like it is back to where it's supposed to be. So that was the whole Dana Altman retirement story that was kind of flying around that I found to be interesting, to say the least. Eventually, he won't be Oregon's coach, but I have no interest in that being anytime soon. I am interested, whenever the season does come to a close, hopefully in the Final Four. Hey, you never know. A boy can dream. I'm interested to see how the recruiting cycle goes, who comes back, and whatnot. But we'll save that for when it's relevant. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.